Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. We continue our series on conventional and unconventional relationships with part one of a conversation with a special return guest, Amy Gahran. Amy is the creator of the relationship escalator, a concept covered on previous episodes. We discuss the hallmarks of the relationship escalator and explore the many ways that people deviate from them, including consensual non-monogamy, big friendship, and of course, a solo lifestyle. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's return guest is Amy Gahran. Amy is a writer and journalist based near Boulder, Colorado. When she's not writing about energy, technology, and business, she's researching and writing about unconventional relationships and the power of social norms. She's currently working on a second edition of her delightful, wonderful, useful 2017 book, Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, a research-based guide to intimate relationship diversity. Amy was a guest on two of my favorite episodes, Getting Off the Relationship Escalator and Defining Solo. Welcome back, Amy.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm good. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Me too. You're a good interviewer. This is always fun.
That's high praise from a journalist.
If you ever get back to the Boulder area, I'm buying you a drink.
I would love that.
Okay.
I would really love that. And I will be back at some point. So this episode is part of a series examining relationships, both conventional and unconventional. And this idea, this model of the relationship escalator has been tremendously helpful to me and to my listeners. And I want to say thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So what we're going to do today is sort of a follow-up to a previous episode in which I had Chris Marsh, a sociologist, and Shane Moss, a stand-up comic. And we talked about the reasons for the hallmarks of the relationship escalator, or what I would call the criteria, the sort of necessary conditions for the relationship escalator and why they exist. And what I want to do today is talk about how people may diverge, how they may live an unconventional life, diverging from this model. But before we do this, let's just assume for a moment that the listener is not a regular listener and they don't know what the relationship escalator is. What is the relationship escalator?
Okay, the relationship escalator is the common bundle, at least in Western cultures, the common bundle of social norms that define how relationships that are considered to be intimate in some significant way, what they're supposed to look like and how they're supposed to work and how they're supposed to progress. There is a trajectory. It works like this. So you meet someone, you think they're hot, you start dating, you probably start having sex. And then you have a lot of emotional investment in it. You fall in love. And then after doing that for a little while, you become exclusive. You move in together. Then we'll get married and probably buy a house and have a few kids and till death do you part.
And so one thing you say is like the kids are optional.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the marriage is probably going to happen. But even if it doesn't, you're supposed to be merged together. You're going to live together. You're going to merge your finances. People are going to see you as a couple. That's fair to say.
Yeah, correct. When we start talking about merging, when we get into what the criteria of this escalator are, it's not just about how you do your relationship. It's literally about your identity, who you think you are, whether you're a me or a we.
Mm-hmm. It's Benifer. I'm sure we could do a whole episode talking about this. You know, I have had this where we have friends. I've had friends who are couples and you just refer to them as a single unit, actually literally merging their names together.
Yeah, they're the ampersand.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so this is pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's really striking about the work that you've done is it's something that we don't even question. It's
Right.
just the way it is.
My whole process of doing this research in this book and books that will follow is basically, yo, fish, there's this stuff called water. You might want to think about it.
Indeed, and I think that it's such a striking idea because not only do you see it in your own personal life, you've seen it with your parents and with your friends and your siblings and with yourself, but it is featured in songs, in movies, in television.
Enshrined in law and finances and the tax code.
Indeed, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as that previous episode did, it talked about, why do these elements, these hallmarks, as you say, exist? Why is it that this coupledom is so important to the world, to governments, to procreation, to intergenerational wealth, et cetera, et cetera. This will be familiar for anyone who listened to the previous episode. But what I'm interested in is the criteria, the hallmarks of these relationships. And you've done this work. You've surveyed thousands of people, and you can see among those people who are on the relationship escalator, who are riding it till death do you part, that there's this common set of criteria that are connected there. And then what we're going to do, as I've already said, is we're going to look at how some people, perhaps present company, diverge from this. But before we do that, I have a general question for you, Amy. And that is, suppose you're not interested in diverging, or as I would say, using my narrative of Solo, of recognize, rebel, and reinvent. Suppose you're not interested in rebelling. Why should someone continue to listen to the podcast as we get into these alternatives?
I'm really glad you asked that, because a lot of times people who do want conventional relationships, whether they're monogamous or merged in terms of living together, legally married, whatever, if that's what you really want, if that's what you really value, then when you start to research the relationship escalator on Google, a lot of the first things you'll find will have stuff having to do with polyamory or various forms of non-monogamy. And that's because a lot of times people who have already stepped off the relationship escalator in some significant way have the most reason to talk and write about it.
Mm-hmm.
But this is definitely not just a concept for people who are non-monogamous or otherwise wanting to diverge significantly from social norms. You mentioned, why is this idea of coupledom so important, and why is it so enshrined in social laws? And as I mentioned, even like laws and health insurance and all things.
I would call them both written rules and unwritten rules.
Correct. And a big reason why that is that you think about why people have relationships, any kind of relationship at all. And a lot of that is to have a sense of belonging, so psychological well-being and emotional well-being, and also logistical support. We are none of us an island. Everybody needs some sort of support from other people in a variety of ways. And the reason why we have relationships is to help do that. But the thing is, people are complicated. And if you are relying on other people to help support you in your life, or if you are willing to help support other people in their lives, it helps to kind of have a grammar for how that works. I mean, that's why social norms exist. If you walk into a bar and I walk up to you and say banana rather than hello, you'd be, huh? Okay, social norms take the friction out of interaction, and relationships provide support so that you can do more, you can scale up. You're not just dependent on yourself for all parts of your life. And those things matter, but they can happen in a lot of different ways. And the more they become popular and reinforced, social norms kind of, they fade into the background and people forget that there are other ways of doing things, which isn't a big deal about greetings, walking up and saying hello. But when it comes to how you run some of the most intimate and vulnerable relationships in your life, they can become too limiting. And for some people, those norms can become difficult or even oppressive. So the reason why people who want to follow those norms should know about this is, if you are looking toward having a particular relationship that's going to be on that escalator, ride it all the way to the top, gold star, and you, and that's what you want. Well, you're going to want to make sure that you are not just coasting on assumptions and finding out after the fact that the other person has very different assumptions about what, say, monogamy means, or whether or how to merge finances, or how close you should be to your friends, or how important sex is in your relationship. And if you are just coasting along on this background it's called the relationship escalator for a reason, because it's coasting on this background of assumptions. So it feels like it has a momentum of its own and you're just being carried along. Really, all the way you're making decisions, it's the staircase, except that if you aren't always conscious about making a decision to go along and follow social norms, it feels like you're being carried.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, if you're not interested in diverging, in rebelling, as I would say, you should know this just to make sure that you and your partner are on the same page, so you don't discover something 30 years from now.
That would be a really crappy surprise, years down the line. And also, and this is more important, we've learned a lot in the past decade, but especially in the last few years in the U.S. and many other Western cultures, of the importance of diversity and inclusiveness. Okay. And there are lots of different cultures and backgrounds and subcommunities, and diversity is a good thing. The catch is with the relationship escalator, it is such a strong and heavily privileged collection of social norms that alternatives to that escalator, other ways of doing other kinds of significantly intimate or committed relationships, tend to be diminished or stigmatized. That's why they say just friends, okay? That's a diminutive, just. And that's why when people even raise the idea of not being monogamous, other people go, what? They get a little freaked out by that, okay? That's what is called a disturbance in the force. Because there is a stigma there. Something is not normal, literally not conforming to social norms. And that can hurt people. That hurts everybody. It hurts people who are stigmatized because their approaches and needs to life and to love are more difficult because they face a lot of stigma and barriers and prejudice and bias. And also it hurts people who might want to be on that escalator, who like it, because I'll bet you that every single person on the escalator knows and cares about people who aren't on the escalator or don't want to be. And you don't want to hurt them. So it helps to know more about this diversity so you can make the world safer for people who you probably know and care about, who just do life and love a bit differently than you.
I think that's well said. I appreciate you bringing that up because I've seen this in this podcast. I actually have married listeners who are on the escalator, and they listen in part because they want to be better at supporting their solo friends and family. And what you're describing sort of reminds me, there's an old movie with Sidney Poitier called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And, you can imagine it's almost like the modern day version of that is Guess Who's Coming to the Dinner Party?
Yes.
Right? As Joe and Jane are well-known swingers. And someone be like, I'm not sure we should invite them to the dinner party because, they're different and they're a little scary or they're whatever it is, there's misinformation about them. And they're not being that diversity in their lifestyle is not being, and we're not even asking people to celebrate it. We're just asking them to accept it.
Right. To accept it and accommodate, make accommodations. Like if you're having a wedding and you send out invitations and it's +1 and somebody wants to bring their best friend or their 2 partners, are you going to allow some flexibility for that?
Yes, that's right. And I do agree with you. It's interesting to hear this because I have worked through, this notion of singleism comes up. If you start talking about single living, you talk about how single people are stereotyped and prejudiced. And, the arguments, of course, are just like, well, it's not the same as heterosexism or racism and so on. And the answer to that may be, okay. However, we know, to your point, that diversity is good and that a diverse place is good. And so to stigmatize single people or folks who are diverging in these other ways, is an act of prejudice. And we should be striving to avoid that. Moreover, sometimes these things intersect, right? So, for example, to be prejudiced against single people, oftentimes they may be single mothers and so on, folks who are already oppressed to begin with. And so I agree with you, regardless of whether you want to ride the escalator or diverge in some way. This, I think, will be a helpful lesson. So let's jump in. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I'm going to talk about one of these hallmarks, one of these criterion, and then let's just have a conversation about how people may not conform.
Okay.
All right. So let's start with, you probably use this in your book, the 800-pound gorilla. Yes, what's that?
I didn't make these up out of whole cloth. I did a fair amount of research on this, just so people know. My book is based on a survey that I did where I got 1,500 in-depth responses from people to several questions that are various versions of, do you believe that your important relationships are unconventional? And if so, how? So some of the things that we're going to be covering, these hallmarks, are things I pretty much knew about, but a couple of them toward the end didn't really occur to me, but they are very important.
Yeah, and I think I would say this, I haven't done the research, but reading through this list and talking about it at length, both on the podcast and at dinner parties, they pass the smell test. They seem self-evident once they're pointed out. So I don't think we're going to run into much controversy, but I think the idea of having there be some survey research behind this is helpful. As the behavioral scientist, I appreciate it. So the 800-pound gorilla, sexual and romantic exclusivity, AKA monogamy.
Right. And it's not just exclusivity. It is exclusivity between two and only two people.
Yes. Okay. So between two and only two partners, commonly called monogamy. Right. So where do we find people who are in a relationship that may not follow this?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's understand what monogamy really is. A lot of times people think that it's about those two people in a monogamous relationship agree to only share sex and romance between themselves. But really, what it comes down to is that you agree not to share sex and romance with anybody else, because it is very common in monogamous relationships for the sexual and romantic part of it to wane. Okay, you are not absolutely entitled to always have sex with your partner forever. But if you're in a monogamous relationship, you're not supposed to do that with anybody else.
I get what you're saying. It's about who you have sex with and who you don't have sex with.
Who you're allowed to have sex with, but definitely who you are not to have sex with.
Okay. And you've already alluded to something about sex versus romantic.
Correct.
What's the difference?
Sexual connection it can mean two things. It's an erotic connection that can be either physical, you're banging genitals or other bodily parts together in an erotically charged way, or some people might even construe it to be kissing or hugging or cuddling or holding hands, the physical contact. Then there is the erotic charge to it. For instance, phone sex. No physical contact, but people who are partners in a long-distance monogamous relationship might engage in that.
Texting.
Kink can be extremely emotionally charged. Does not necessarily involve, it can be emotionally charged and erotic, but doesn't necessarily involve anybody getting naked or bumping anything up together.
Got it. So before we get into some of these ways, so there's sort of, when I think about kind of like infidelity, right? It's that you had sex with someone else. You shouldn't have done that. You flirted with someone else. You shouldn't be doing that, right? It's just expressing some interest. And then this idea of you're sharing emotional details with some other person that you might not be with your partner.
Yeah, this is why I'm working on a whole other research project and probably a book called Monogamy, the Fine Print.
Yeah. So it's a complex constellation of behaviors that are supposed to be.
Right. But the point of monogamy is that there is only one person that you share these important forms of intimacy with. So who's not doing that is anybody. It's very interesting. Non-monogamy is very common, and it's a social norm in two circumstances. The first is what's commonly known as casual or uncommitted dating or casual or uncommitted sex, which is pretty commonly accepted in most social circles in Western culture, with the exception of very socially or religiously conservative. But the point is that that's just something you do until you find the one person that you want to settle down with. The other circumstance in which non-monogamy is socially normative is cheating. Okay. And the thing is that cheating, people often look down on it. That's when you have sex with or share romance with or otherwise violate a monogamous commitment without letting your monogamous partner know you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that there's a lot of, like we said, grammar of social norms. People know how cheating works. And
Mm-hmm.
it's extremely common. And when somebody finds out that somebody else has been cheating, they might be angry or hurt. They won't be confused. They know what's going on. There are a lot of conventions that support the practice of cheating. So non-monogamy is common. What's not common is consensual non-monogamy. Okay, that's when people who are intimate with each other agree, they're transparent with each other, that that activity is not exclusive to just the two of them. There are a variety of ways that they might engage sexually or romantically with other people. Some people set a lot of rules about it. Some people say, well, that's something that we do as a couple. Like we might have a special guest star in the bedroom sometime. And this can range from everything from the special guest star, the more monogamish approach, all the way up to polyamory, where you can have multiple concurrent emotional relationships, more than one at a time, that might achieve some level of depth or commitment.
Yeah. So as a quick aside, and I get a kick out of this, right? So that special guest star, right? So if a couple might have a threesome they bring someone in, maybe it's a sex worker, or maybe it's someone who volunteers for this just for the fun of it all. That person has a particular moniker in the world, which is unicorn. It's like this sort of special person. And I always get a kick of being on the dating apps or whatever. And there's these women who just describe themselves as a unicorn, because they're not talking about themselves as a unicorn in that threesome way, but as a one-of-a-kind, special, mythical creature that's not supposed to exist. And so I just get a kick out of the fact that these ladies may not realize that there's a double meaning to that term.
Terminology frequently conflicts in different subcultures. Welcome to the 21st century. Roll with it.
Indeed. Yes, that's very funny. So you said consensual non-monogamy. This might be swinging that I mentioned earlier.
Swinging. It could even be don't ask, don't tell relationships, where they consent to having other connections, but you are not allowed to, disclose to each other. You're supposed to kind of pretend it's not really happening. And all those relationships are consensual non-monogamy is possible. I'm polyamorous, and my personal experience is that it is the consent that freaks a lot of people out more than the non-monogamy. They're like, ooh, you get to have sex with other people, but wait a second, you're agreeing with it? I might meet this other person and talk to them, and you might expect me to be at least nice to them. That's the thing that freaks a lot of people out, because the consent means that you are acknowledging the validity and the existence and validity of these other connections.
And you said monogamish.
Right.
And does Dan Savage get credit for that term?
As far as I know. I think he actually had a contest for it at some point.
And what is monogamish?
It tends to refer to relationships between two people where they are primarily sexually monogamous, and they're definitely socially monogamous. They really present as a couple, as a unit, but they might occasionally have recreational sex with other people. And sometimes they do that on the down low. And sometimes they'll go to sex parties or strip clubs or swinger events. But that's more of
Burning Man.
Yeah, that's more of something that they do occasionally, usually as a recreational thing. It's not usually an ongoing feature of their relationship on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I have a buddy. He describes himself to potential partners. He says, I'm 90% monogamous.
Yeah, that's a fair way to describe it.
Yeah, that's how he does this.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Merging life infrastructure and identity. Right? So you move in, you merge your finances. How might people not do that? Okay,
so merging is basically making a relationship difficult to disentangle yourself from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It demonstrates commitments by making it hard to leave.
Yes.
Okay? That's one way of looking at it. It's also a way of pooling resources to build a shared foundation, being able to scale up. And both of these are valid ways to look at it. However, merging resources, because it does make a relationship more difficult to lead, and because other people tend to see you less as an individual and more as part of a unit, and you may begin to see yourself that way. A lot of people don't like to do that because they don't like to lose their individuality and autonomy within a relationship.
If I may, I'm glad to hear you say this, because in our previous episode, those are the reasons that we came up with, right? One is survival. It's just easier to, when you pool your resources in order to survive in a world that is, expensive and so on. And then the other one, of course, is it's harder to walk away,
right?
When you have all this stuff. Shane Moss, who was the guest on this, joked he has furnished several apartments of his exes and never took a couch with him on the way out the door.
Aside from matters of choice, though, like wanting to preserve your autonomy, there can be logistical considerations. For instance, people might want to live together if it was possible, but maybe immigration restrictions, they might be in different countries or in different continents. Or there might be logistical considerations, like somebody might be neurodiverse somewhere along the autism spectrum, and they really cannot stand to have a lot of chaos in their environment, and the other partner has young children.
Yes, right.
So living together isn't really an option. Or somebody might be low income and receiving public benefits that if they legally married or shared a house with somebody or got any financial support from a partner, they would lose that financial support from the public benefit. So there are a lot of reasons why, not just people not wanting to merge, but there are a lot of reasons why people don't, for one reason or another.
Yeah, a guy said to me, he said, I want my wife to be my neighbor, right? He's okay with getting married, but he doesn't want her living in his house.
Okay, so how do people not do that? That is a very increasingly common way to do it, is what a lot of people call a living apart together relationship, or sometimes called a partners. And this is a relationship where it's usually two monogamous people in a committed relationship. They might even be legally married. They might be co-parents, but for one reason or another, they choose not to or cannot share a home.
It could be apartments in the same building. They could be homes on the other side of the country.
Correct. Yes. But they do not share a domicile full time. They may live together part time or something like that. But yeah, another approach to it is, when people may live together, but they choose to keep their finances very separate.
I see. Okay. And as a result, they might have budgets, or I pay this, you pay that. They have agreements about how they divvy up and pay for things.
Right. And they might have, if they are moving in together or getting married, they might have some sort of prenuptial or other agreement specifying out, this is my money and property, that's yours, which is very important because in the U.S., many states have common law marriage, where if you live together for a certain amount of time, you're legally considered married, and the relationship ends at that point. Somebody might be entitled to part of your property or funds.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I may disclose myself, this is when I have reluctance within relationships. This often comes up for me. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, right? Because I host a podcast called Solo, right? And so I'm I have a very strong sort of approach towards autonomy, and I like my space a certain way. And I've worked hard to achieve financial independence. It was uncertain for the first 40 years of my life, you know what I mean? And so on. And so the idea of inviting someone into that and the risks that can come along with regard to, which can come along with that, both emotional, financial, and psychological, and so on. And so it's not one of those things where I say I would never do it, but it's not an obvious one for me. So you were really good in your previous episode defining solo, in sort of talking about that solo mentality. Does that fit within
the unmerged relationship, or as I like to think of it, as a more autonomous approach to intimate relationships? Yes, quite definitely. Solo is a way of approaching life. It doesn't necessarily mean avoiding intimate relationships. It's not synonymous with single, as single is conventionally defined as having no current significantly committed or ongoing intimate relationships. And the thing about solohood for a lot of people is you have worked hard to build your own nest egg and your nest. I've done that in my own life. I was married at one point and got unmarried over a decade ago. I've been longtime self-employed. Personal resilience is very important to me. I worked very hard. I own my own home. I have housemates, but they are housemates. They pay rent. And I make sure that my property is my property, in part because I didn't have this experience with my own divorce, but I have known so many other people who experienced severe financial disruption and even impoverishment and homelessness as a result of a bad divorce. And it's very important to me as a matter of personal resilience to maintain my own financial and property independence. So I do that. And that's beneficial for me. That does have some limitations, I mean, if I were married to somebody and we had twice the income, we could put down a hell of a lot bigger down payment on the house,
Yeah. And I mean, if I'm really being fully honest with myself as I reflect on this, and again, this is so interesting. And this is to your point. I think it is useful for people to consider each of these criterion to see how much their own preferences and lifestyle gels with it or not. To me, my reluctance with merging is actually less about the finances, and it's more about my space. And the idea of inviting someone into my space 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year is not appealing to me, no matter how much I like them. This is not about how much I like or love someone. It's about I enjoy some level of solitude. It's good for me. And it's actually good for my relationship that I have a certain amount of solitude.
I have a similar experience. Me being solo and having structured my life that way means that I bring my best self to everybody I care about in my life. And that's not just about my two sweethearts. That's about all my friends. That's about my family. That's about my work relationships. That is very useful and valuable for me. It was a late discovery. I'm fifth out of six kids. I grew up in a crowded house, and I went from there to moving in with my boyfriend at the time, who I later married. And then it wasn't until we got unmarried that I used to be terrified of the idea of living alone. And it wasn't until we got unmarried that I kind of sat around and says, wait a second, this kind of rocked. And I discovered a whole new level of psychological and emotional health and resilience that I had never had access before, because social norms prejudiced me against the very option that was healthy for me.
Well said. And you and I think, are similar, not in our story, but in our value. And I'm actually working on a forthcoming series about the value of solitude and the mythology of solitude. And one of the things that I think happens a lot is, as someone who values creative work, is solitude is often a very good space to do creative work, reflection, and so on. And this is not to be immodest, but to your point about bringing a full cup and being able to pour it for others, is I had some friends, old friends, that I visited them, and they said, you're not always around, but when you are around, you are fully present. You are 100%. That was really touching thing for someone to say and to notice, because, and I think this happens sometimes, and I'm going to misquote this, but Neil Brennan, who's a comedian and a solo, I think that's fair to describe him as having a solo mentality, and who listens to the podcast on occasion. He has a joke about partners who want him 100% of the time. He's a charming guy, he's a funny guy, he's a smart guy. And his thing is like, again, this is not quoting directly, but he's like, you can get me 40% of the time, but it's a pretty great 40%. You get to be my date to the Oscars. And so you could have 100% with someone else. It might be okay, but you might get 40 with me, and it's a great 40. And so, this is a matter, I think, of like partners matching in a sense.
I have generally found that most numerical or mathematical analogies to relationships really break down, because people don't work like that. Relationships don't work like that. It comes down to what does function, what is healthy for the individuals involved and within the context that they are connecting to each other. It's like if you tried to break down love according to how many people are involved, well, then my parents didn't love me very much, because I'm fifth out of six kids. And I really find that the more good quality connections that I have in my life, and they are very different types, and they all take different levels of time and energy, and that changes over time because people are moving targets. What matters more is how good is the quality of the connection? What is it bringing to the people involved in it? And that almost never breaks down numerically.
I think that's fair to say. I know this intimacy coach, her name's Amy Patuski. I think that's how I pronounce her last name. Forgive me, Amy, if I mispronounce your last name. She says feel over formula.
Yeah.
She thinks too often people have a set of rules when they should really use their emotions to guide their judgments and choices. Yeah. And I think when it comes to people, especially, that's useful.
Well, and this discussion about like numerical analogies breaking us down brings us into the next hallmark of the relationship escalator, which is hierarchy.
Indeed it is. That is, some relationships are considered more important than others. And so it becomes perhaps zero sum, where some win and some lose when it comes to choices.
Right. Like, for instance, monogamy, which, because monogamy is such a weighty benchmark of the relationship escalator, it's one hell of a hierarchy because there can be only one. Well, you cannot get any more hierarchical than that. So hierarchy takes a lot of forms. Now, for people who are in conventional relationships, who are riding the relationship escalator, it means that that escalator partner, it's not really about who's more important or who you love most. Okay. It's really not. It is practical. It's about which person or relationship takes default priority over any other adult relationship that is not rooted in caregiving. Okay. So for instance, that's why people say, well, your kids come first. Well, if they're not adults on their own, then you have a caregiving responsibility. You may have a caregiving responsibility to an elderly or disabled person, those sorts of things. And in a sense, working relationships are caregiving responsibilities because you have responsibility to keep that part of the working relationship functioning. But when it comes to personal relationships, your escalator partner is supposed to take priority for your time, attention, and resources over your friends, family members that you do not have care-based responsibility for, over community commitments, over anything more than the absolutely most essential work or career commitments, and over your commitments to yourself. That's a hell of a hierarchy, okay? And this is not exclusive to the relationship escalator. People who practice consensual non-monogamy, hierarchy is often, but not always, a feature or bug, it depends on what side of the fence you're on about it, of those relationships. For instance, swinging is a very couple-centric approach to consensual non-monogamies. It's often something that people, usually a married or cohabiting heterosexual couple, not always, but usually, want to engage sexually with other in a very organized setting where recreational sex of various kinds are available. And that's something that they do as a couple. And they set a lot of rules. And they set the rules because they assume that as a couple, as a privileged entity, they are entitled to set certain rules of engagement with other people. And, if a single person, it came up to a couple in a swingers club, and the single person requirements or rules conflicted with the couples, guess who's going to win that?
Right.
Yeah. So basically, hierarchy, and in polyamory, it gets very different because in polyamory, it's not recreational. It's people's hearts are real. Well, it's not just romantic because remember, people who are aromantic along that spectrum, which we'll talk about in a bit, it can be involved in any kind of intimate relationship, including polyamorous ones. But people who feel a certain deep level of emotional investment or other kinds of commitment to an intimate relationship, it can really suck to realize that you are going to be, your needs, feelings, goals, priorities will be intrinsically deprioritized during that relationship because somebody else comes first.
Got it. I see what you mean.
Yeah, and a lot of people do hierarchical polyamory or non-monogamy because they want to reassure their partner that, yeah, you really matter to me because you're going to be first out
You're
of
my
everybody.
number one. Yeah.
Right, but think about how that plays out in real time and in the real world for other people who you claim to love.
Got it. I understand what you're saying. I will say this. I do, as someone, and this is related to what you were saying at the outset of this about the value of friends and how important they are, not only to survive, but for us to thrive, for us to flourish. I set out in a previous episode, Solo Thoughts 5, where I talk about a new narrative with this idea of recognize, rebel, and reinvent for the solo. But in the sort of reinvention stage, I talk about taking care of your sort of foundation, your health, your wealth, and your team, as I like to say. Who are the people in your life that help keep you sort of afloat, to use Scott Barry Kaufman's term. But then also they even can help you flourish. They can help you kind of catch wind, so to speak, to use his model. So I've seen this a number of times, and it actually, to be honest, it really bothers me. And it bothers me even more now that I understand it all. And that is, I have a friend, someone comes along, he or she becomes intimate with that person, and then that person suddenly becomes unavailable, or, their behavior changes where like you can see that special status, that hierarchy come out. You know what I mean? Like, and it's because of that person, because should they break up, that person just wants to go back to business as usual. I find that to be a bit of a problem, in part because, it's just sort of waving it in your face, right? Like you are not as important as you thought you were, to that other person. Now, I am forgiving of it because I don't think these people even know that they're really it's not a conscious choice, right? It's just what you do. It's just the way it is. You're swept up in it.
It's what's normal.
It's what's normal. It's normal to do that. It would be abnormal to continue to treat the friendship and give it the importance that it deserves.
Normal, not just as in ordinary, but as in socially normative.
Indeed, yes. So that's my mini rant. And as someone who's just finished a series on how valuable friends are, you could see why I might rant in that way without actually ranting. So how do people diverge from this? How do they rebel against this special status, this hierarchy?
Well, first of all, you're preaching to the choir, dude.
And I'm probably preaching to the audience also, who say, I get emails from people who say, it's the only podcast I listen to that I find myself saying amen when I hear stuff on there.
Right. Well, remember, why do people have relationships at all? And a lot of that is to have a sense of belonging and to have a network, a mutual support network. Okay. And friendships are relationships that are completely voluntary. There is no legal enforcement of friendship. And if you break up with a friend, nobody gets alimony. So when people decide that hierarchy does not align with their values, or at least hierarchy as determined by social norm does not align with their values, that they have people who are important to them and they are not going to choose between those people, or those choices are made situationally and not by default. You don't necessarily always have to put your spouse ahead of your close friend, or somebody who might not be as close a friend, but is somebody who is really in need of support right now, or something that is a pursuit just for yourself, needing some more time alone, or to develop your own interest or do your own education or something like that. So when people do not practice hierarchy, which is default prioritization of one or a certain type of relationships, then what they end up doing is a more egalitarian approach to relationships. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what egalitarian relationship means. A lot of people assume incorrectly that it means attempting to equally dole out your attention, affection, resources, whatever, among a certain number of people. Like if you're polyamorous and you have 3 partners, you try to spend exactly 33.333% of your time with each of them, No, it doesn't work like that. Again, numerical analogies break down when it comes to real relationships with real people. And it's not an attempt to make not necessarily an attempt to make relationships identical or to have that goal that they should all eventually become identical. For instance, just because somebody is polyamorous doesn't mean they're necessarily looking to cohabit with all their partners. Mm-hmm. Some polyamorous people do prefer that and do have situations like that or have that as a goal or a fantasy, but a lot of us don't. I don't want to live with any of my partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you live with other people, not your partners.
Correct. I have 2 housemates who give me a check every month. Okay. Mm-hmm. But neither of them are sexual or romantic partners. I do have 2 sexual and romantic partners. They are my sweethearts. They are not necessarily more important than the other people that I consider to be my really close people. It's not to say that you have to treat everybody the same. Like somebody off the street, I'm not going to treat them the same as one of my dearest friends of many years. But among the people that I personally, because egalitarianism is important to me in my close personal relationships. And in those relationships that I choose to invest that level of myself in, I am not going to necessarily say that one is more important than the other.
I see. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. For instance, I have 2 sweethearts. They're wonderful. They both live not terribly far from me, but it's pandemic times. They both live alone. One of my dearest friends, who actually also happens to be my former spouse, lives right across the street from me. Mm-hmm. I see my friend, who's my former spouse, almost every day. But my 2 sweethearts, I see each of them usually once a week.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
So this divergence, this rebellion, I think also happens, and this was part of a previous episode with Raina Cohen about making friends the center of life. I'm actually curious, Amy, if you know a better term for this. Raina calls them platonic partners, which is an awful term, but this term like big friendship or something like that, where she kicks off this Atlantic article, which I'll put in the exhibits, with a story of a woman who meets a man and says to him, listen, you're never going to be number one. You just need to know that because this other woman, my friend, is number one. And she was here before you. She'll be here with you and she'll be around after you. And so that's turning that hierarchy on its head, so to speak. Do you have a good term or language for someone who might prioritize friendship or this non-relationship escalator relationship in a way that gives it higher status?
I just think of it as an egalitarian approach to important relationships. Because here's the thing, those relationships can be almost any kind. It could be with an academic mentor. It could be with your coworkers, okay?
Business partner.
A business partner. It can be with a neighbor or some community that you're involved with. It can be with yourself. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the idea that a relationship should automatically be ranked ahead and default prioritized above others just because it involves sex and or romance, that just doesn't work for me. It really, especially because sex and romance have such a capacity to hijack human psychology and really lead to bad decision making if you aren't consciously reminding yourself that other things matter in your life too, that you have other priorities. So for me, I mean, personal resilience is very important to me, and being egalitarian and being very conscious about the commitments I make and walking my talk on them, regardless of what's happening in other relationships, or if I can't for some reason, being very transparent and renegotiating those relationships. That's very important to me.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I think it's good for people to hear this. I have gotten really far in life because of my friendships and sometimes in spite of my romantic relationships. And so I'm not going to cast aside my friends just because I have a new partner. There's a story I heard. I wish I could remember who it was who told me this, and it might have even been secondhand, but it was a story of a couple who was on the relationship escalator. And one of the members of the couple was behaving very badly. And this person said, listen, I love you, but I love myself more. And if you keep doing this, I'm going to break off this relationship. I'm not going to put you ahead of me. That stands out to me as something that seems extraordinary because of the rules, the norms that exist in the world, which is like, I would die for you. You know what I mean? Like, I would lay down my life in order to see you, survive. And to have someone articulated in that kind of way, which I thought was still compassionate, but also was firm about, and I don't remember if it was his or her, it doesn't matter, their own identity and their own well-being.
There is a flip side of the hierarchy, which is that when people are in relationships that are by default deprioritized, given a lower priority, whether that be a non-sexual, non-romantic friendship, because friendship can include sex and or romance too. That's a whole other thing.
We'll get to that. Huh?
Yeah. But, or a neighbor or a mentor or somebody you're mentoring, those sorts of things. If those relationships get deprioritized because somebody has a new romantic partner or because they have a jealous spouse or whatever, because people get, in monogamy, it's very common for people to say you shouldn't be too close to your friends. Mm-hmm. It's referred to as a greedy institution. Esther Perel has called it that. And I love that way of looking at it because it really is. It demands all the attention. If you are default deprioritized, you are basically supposed to accept that. You're supposed to know your place. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to defer to that default higher priority relationship willingly, gladly, and accept whatever, substitute or, shreds of what you used to have in that relationship are available to you now. That's not to say relationships can't change, but when you are deprioritizing yourself in your own relationship, in deference to a relationship that you were not in, wow, that kind of sucks, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never been a fan of anything that says I'm supposed to know my place. I make my place.
Yeah. So there's a phrase in the in The Departed that says, "I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me."
Right. And these things are very individualistic, and we're talking a lot about individualistic approaches to relationship. Individualism has its trade-offs too, which is why, relationships are important. And that's not to say, hey, how dare you deprioritize me? But people who choose to deprioritize their network of support in order to put all their eggs in one basket, that tells you a lot about how much you can rely on them.
Yeah, I think that, to me, individuality and community are not mutually exclusive. I think that they can operate together.
Interdependence is a thing.
Indeed. That's it for part 1. Thanks for listening. In the next episode, we will continue the conversation with a look at the next hallmark of the relationship escalator, a sexual and romantic connection. At the end of part 2, Amy will also be presenting some tips if you're interested in exploring how to step off the relationship escalator. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider rating, reviewing, telling friends and family members, signing up for the Solo newsletter, and joining our private Solo Slack channel, which you can find more about at petermcgraw.org. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.org. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.